A good Erev Shabbos. The Serenity Prayer from the Recovery Movement is probably something you're familiar with. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference, which itself is not a bad way for any of us to get through life. This worthy attitude has spawned any number of satires and ironic takes, from a coffee mug that says, God grant me coffee to change the things that I can change, and wine to accept the things that I cannot, all the way to the handyman's prayer, God grant me WD-40 for things that should move but don't, and duct tape for things that do move that shouldn't. It's usually more productive to talk about things that we have some influence or ability or capacity to change, like, for example, ourselves. So let's begin with that. We're in the middle of Sfirat HaOmer now, counting the Omer, from Pesach to Shavuot. The Omer refers to a measure of barley offering that was brought in temple times. The Torah tells us to take an offering from the first crop that ripens in the spring, and then count the days that we're able to bring it from the second day of Passover for 49 days, after which we know it's Shavuot. That's the essence of the mitzvah. Since we don't have offerings yet at the moment, we just count the days. People who were taught about this as kids usually did not get much, if any, accompanying explanation about what it means or what that counting could accomplish. In simpler words, why counting counts. Thankfully, in our days, there's much more information and insight available, not just in books, but even online. So better understanding of why we do this and what it means for us is much closer at hand than it probably ever was. Moving from Passover to Shavuot seems like just counting days off the calendar, and at minimum it could be that. Yet moving from being slaves to becoming truly free people who choose our path in godliness, in holiness, and in humanity in just 7 weeks is a major shift in perspective, and that is part of what we can focus on in these precious days. Each week, in fact, each day, has a unique refinement and insight accompanying it that we can tap into. We started discussing this a little bit over the first days of Pesach. Let's take, for example, today, this Shabbat. Shabbos is the 9th day of the Omer. If you look in the Siddur, or on either one of our handy-dandy Sfirat HaOmer counters, which are posted in the shul, see, another good reason to come to shul every day, you'll see that the Sfira combination associated with Shabbat is Gevura Shebegevura, the 9th day of counting, Gevura Shebegevura, or severity within severity, discipline within discipline. Each of the elements, which we rendered roughly into English as kindness, severity, harmony, endurance, splendor, bonding, and nobility, each of those is comprised of each of the others. So last week we spoke about the kindness element within kindness. Then the next day was the discipline element within kindness, the harmony element within kindness, and so forth. This week it's all about Gevura. Gevura is strength, it's also severity, it's also judgment, it's also discipline, limitation, restraint. So think of all those, and then think of Gevura Shebegevura, which is our focus today. Think about discipline within discipline, or maybe strength within restraint. Last year, on the daily thought of the day after Shacharis, we went through a very interesting book by Chani Juravel called Sfira in Our Lives, Transforming Our Relationships with Ourselves, with Others, and with Hashem. That's the title of the book. Again, this is just one of the at least 8 or 10 spiritual guides to the Omer period that you'll find on books in the bookstores or online. So, for Shabbat, Gevura Shebegevura, she gives an explanation as well as a little story based on personal experience. In summary, she writes that we all want to be disciplined in some way, whether it means getting more organized or eating healthier or achieving better balance in our routine, whatever it happens to be. And taking a step back and evaluating how that discipline is or is not working is itself a worthwhile exercise. Meaning, and this is her question of the day, Are we disciplined and true to our standards in the way we approach and apply our goals of discipline? She tells a story of a friend who was dating in the shidduch world. This friend went on a date with a man into his 40s, let's say, who was still single. An impressive guy, but her friend said after the meeting, he has a bit of a temper, but it's really something he wants to work on. With a little bit more description, Mrs. Juravel realized who this person was, and also realized that she had actually met him as a prospective shidduch more than 20 years before. At that time, when he was in his 20s, this fellow said he had every intention of, quote-unquote, working on his anger. He knew it had to be done, but as it turned out, in the intervening 2 decades, he seemed not to have even developed a plan as to how to go about working on that part of himself. That is a lack of discipline in discipline. The restraint and judgment needed to improve on restraining some of the more problematic parts of his personality. So, Chani Juravel's suggestion for her daily call to action, which there is one at the end of each day, she writes in the book, is to make a pie chart of how time in our week is allocated and then write an ideal chart of how it should be, how it could be, and compare our ideal ways to spend time with the actual results, how we actually run our lives, and create a plan for closing the gap between the actual and the ideal. Okay, that's something worth working on and something that we could potentially see real results. Let's reflect for a moment on things that perhaps we cannot change. There's a catastrophe at the beginning of our parsha this week. It happened on the 8th day, Vayhi Bayom HaShmini. It was the unthinkable, the awful tragedy for which it's hard to find words, the death of a child. In fact, 2 children. No one should ever know from any such thing. Aaron HaKohen, our high priest, our first Kohen Gadol, and the brother of Moshe Rabbeinu, had 4 sons. 2 of them died, as our portion opens, with what should have been a moment of national rejoicing, the days of dedicating and inaugurating the Mishkan, the portable shul that we carried with us through 40 years of wandering in the desert. The deaths of these 2 of his sons leave their father Aaron speechless. Vayidom Aharon, the Torah says, Aaron was silent. The commentaries themselves are hardly speechless, and they suggest numerous possibilities as to what may have laid behind this surprising turn of events and what it might have to teach us. The Midrash in Yalkut Shimoni records that silence was not Aaron's first response, rather, as we might expect, a cry of pain and horror. There was also a dose of survivor guilt, perhaps, according to the Yalkut, as Aaron thought that perhaps he had done something to deserve this awful occurrence in his life. Later on, he sat in silence, speechless, as the Torah says. When we studied the book of Job a few years ago, we discussed in depth the thought that a person might accept the unhappy things in life with the same measure of recognition as the good things, that it all comes from above. This is a real challenge to us, living as we are in an age where we still have Holocaust survivors among us, albeit fewer nowadays. We can still hear from the words of those who witnessed it before their eyes that not just 1, not just 2, but 1.5 million children ascended to heaven in pillars of smoke. On the one hand, we cannot remain silent. On the other hand, what words can possibly encompass the loss of a single child, let alone at that incomprehensible scale? Perhaps both responses are necessary at some level of our being. We do cry out. We do wonder, where could it have come from? How could it have happened? What, if anything, can be done to prevent another such tragedy to us or to any other people at this or any other magnitude? And at the same time, we know that for all the testimonies, for all the eyewitnesses, for all the thousands of volumes of scholarship and history that have been produced, written in the decades since the Holocaust, we still have no words that can encompass the event or even begin to make sense of. So, at some level, we're left with silence. There will be commemorations this week in Toronto and around the world on Yom HaShoah, Monday night and Tuesday, and yet, at some level, perhaps the most eloquent response will be silence. This Shabbat, we will also bless the month of Iyar, which begins this coming Thursday night and Friday and continues through Shabbat. The reappearance of the moon in Jerusalem, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, will take place this Thursday afternoon at 2:08 p.m. and 13 parts. The Moiled wird sein Donnerstag nach Mittag, 8 Minuten nach 2 Zeger mit 13 Chalakim. A good Shabbos and a guten Chodesh.